When people imagine survival, they picture a door slamming shut, steel, concrete, silence. The world burns above, but they're safe below. That image has survived for decades because it feels decisive. Final, reassuring. You did the thing. You built the bunker. You won. The problem is that collapse doesn't reward decisiveness. It rewards adaptability. And bunkers are the opposite of adaptable. During the Cold War, governments taught a simple story. If the worst happens, go underground and wait. Posters showed neat families behind thick doors, clocks on the wall, order preserved. What they didn't show was time stretching into uncertainty, weeks turning into months. Supplies becoming calculations, the psychological cost of being sealed away while the outside world keeps changing without you. Bunkers don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they assume the threat is short, visible, and predictable. A blast, fallout, then recovery. But real collapse doesn't follow a countdown. It drags on, it mutates. It shifts from one danger to another. A bunker locks you into a single answer while the question keeps changing. Once underground, every variable tightens. Air is no longer background, it's a resource. Water stops being plentiful and becomes finite. Waste doesn't disappear, it accumulates. Information vanishes first. You don't know what's happening above you, when it's safe to emerge, or if the world you plan to return to still exists. Time loses meaning, and when time loses meaning, judgment follows. History shows something uncomfortable. Most people don't die in the initial event. They die later. They die trying to leave shelters at the wrong moment. They die from disease, miscalculation, and exhaustion after weeks of constrained living. They die because the place that was supposed to protect them became a trap when conditions changed. Cold War analysts eventually noticed a pattern they didn't advertise. The groups that fared best weren't the ones hiding deepest. They were the ones who stayed mobile, flexible, and unremarkable. Survivability wasn't about resisting danger head-on. It was about avoiding attention long enough for danger to pass. That realization produced a different doctrine. One that didn't look heroic. No steel doors. No dramatic countdowns. No guarantee of comfort. It focused on reducing visibility, minimizing patterns, and staying compatible with whatever systems were still limping along. Survival above ground, in plain sight, without becoming a target. This approach never made it into public pamphlets because it didn't sell certainty. It didn't sell construction projects or equipment lists. It asked people to tolerate ambiguity, discomfort, and restraint. It required discipline instead of fortification. And yet, it worked. Quietly, repeatedly, in scenario after scenario. Instead of fortresses, it taught people how to be forgettable. How to blend instead of retreat. How to let chaos pass over them without being swept into it. That lesson was never glamorous, but it outlasted concrete. And it still works today. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from. And hit subscribe while you're here. While the public was shown blast diagrams, fallout maps, and shelter posters, a different conversation unfolded quietly behind closed doors. It wasn't meant for mass distribution. It didn't translate well into slogans. And it certainly didn't inspire confidence. It focused on something far less dramatic than bunkers or heroic last stands. It focused on dispersion. Cold War analysts realized early that survival wasn't primarily a technical problem. It was a behavioral one. Bombs mattered, but people mattered more. Specifically, how people moved, gathered, panicked, and competed once normal order fractured. The most dangerous force after collapse wasn't the weapon. It was human convergence. The core idea was simple and unsettling. The safest position is the one that never becomes relevant. Instead of concentrating people into shelters that could be mapped, monitored, and overwhelmed, dispersion spread risk thin. No single point of failure. No single prize, nothing worth fighting over. This strategy assumed a truth many survival myths ignore. After the initial shock, most danger comes from other people reacting under stress. Crowds attract attention. Attention attracts control. Control attracts resistance. Fixed shelters turn into magnets for desperation, enforcement, or violence. Strength invites challenge. Visibility invites testing. Dispersion attacks that chain reaction at its source. When panic hits, people move toward landmarks. They follow signs, sirens, authority figures, and familiar structures. Shelters fill. Lines form. Clusters emerge. And clusters become pressure points where disease spreads, tempers flare, and force concentrates. Dispersion breaks that instinct by removing the incentive to gather in the first place. The Cold War doctrine flipped human instinct on its head. Instead of centralizing resources, it distributed them lightly. Instead of fortifying a single location, it reduced dependency on any one place. Instead of preparing to defend, it prepared to be ignored. This is why some of the most resilient survival plans involved environments that looked unimportant. Ordinary apartments, low-traffic buildings, areas without symbolic value. Places that didn't promise safety, but also didn't attract desperation. No fences. No guards, no visible preparedness, just normality maintained quietly. Because preparedness that announces itself stops being protection. It becomes provocation. The doctrine also accepted an uncomfortable reality. Survival is not about preserving comfort. It's about sustaining function. Bunkers aim to preserve a lifestyle, privacy, security, control. Dispersion preserves a heartbeat. One buys weeks of certainty. The other buys months or years of adaptability. People who understand dispersion don't wait for evacuation orders or official triggers. They adjust early, before movement becomes dangerous. They simplify their needs. They reduce patterns. They shrink their footprint so that survival costs less attention and less energy. They don't disappear completely. They fade. By the time others are rushing towards shelters and gathering points, these people are already distributed, already quiet, already forgotten. And in collapse, invisibility isn't weakness. It's protection. Above-ground survival sounds reckless to anyone raised on bunker mythology. It feels exposed, temporary, unfinished. There's no heavy door to close, no clear moment where you declare yourself safe. And that discomfort is exactly why it works. Above-ground survival doesn't promise certainty. It preserves options. Bunkers fail because they turn survival into a single decision that can't be revised. Once you're inside, your world shrinks to what you brought with you and what you guessed correctly in advance. Above-ground survival refuses that gamble. It allows movement without panic, adjustment without commitment, and the ability to leave a bad situation before it becomes lethal. Cold War planners understood something modern survival culture still ignores. Collapse is uneven. It doesn't hit all places at once or in the same way. One neighborhood locks down while another still functions. One system collapses while another continues limping forward. Being above ground lets you exploit those gaps. Being underground blinds you to them. Staying above ground keeps you aligned with reality as it changes. You see which stores stop restocking and which ones quietly do. You notice when routines slip, when crowds shift, when certain hours become unsafe and others calm. Information doesn't arrive as announcements. It arrives as patterns. Observation becomes your intelligence network. This matters because the most dangerous moment in any collapse is not the event itself, but the delay between collapse and recognition. People inside bunkers wait for confirmation. They wait for official signals. They wait for permission to emerge. By the time clarity arrives, it's often too late to act safely. Above-ground survival removes that delay. You respond as conditions change, not after they harden. There's also a biological reality bunker plans rarely account for. Humans deteriorate in isolation. Cognitive sharpness drops, risk assessment becomes distorted. Decision-making slows, motivation erodes. People don't just run out of food or water underground. They run out of clarity. Small uncertainties become overwhelming when there's no external reference point. Above ground, even limited interaction keeps the mind calibrated. You hear voices, you observe behavior, you compare notes with reality. That feedback loop matters. It keeps fear proportional. It keeps decisions grounded. It prevents the mental drift that turns manageable problems into fatal mistakes. Above-ground survival also preserves adaptability. You can downshift when pressure rises. You can relocate when attention increases. You can abandon a compromised position without losing everything. Bunkers demand defense. Above-ground survival allows disengagement. Cold War planners saw this repeatedly. The people who endured longest weren't the ones who hid deepest or fortified hardest. They were the ones who stayed flexible, unremarkable, and ready to move. They didn't look like survivors. They looked like background. Bunkers promise safety by sealing you away from the world. This strategy delivers survival by keeping you compatible with it. Collapse does not reward strength. It rewards low contrast. When systems fail, attention becomes a weapon, and anything that stands out gets tested first. The Cold War strategy understood this long before survival culture turned preparedness into a performance. What survives longest isn't the strongest presence, it's the one that barely registers. Bunkers glow. Generators glow. Tactical gear glows. Anything that looks intentional, fortified, or prepared becomes a signal. And signals attract interest, from desperate people searching for solutions, organized groups looking for leverage, or authorities trying to reassert control. Visibility creates questions. Questions create pressure. Pressure creates conflict. Being boring is camouflage. Above-ground survival works when your life looks ordinary even as systems decay around. Lights come on sometimes, not always. You don't announce power independence. You don't move supplies in daylight. You don't fix problems in ways that make others curious. Your environment looks slightly inconvenient, slightly imperfect, and completely unremarkable. This works because human attention under stress is lazy. People scan for contrast. They move toward noise, light, crowds, and visible order. They ignore what blends in: quiet apartments, dim streets, places that don't promise answers. Forgettable spaces get skipped because they don't look useful or threatening. Cold War planners called this social shadowing. You stay close enough to normal life to benefit from what still functions: utilities, routines, residual order, but far enough away to avoid its failures. You don't isolate completely because isolation is fragile. You don't integrate fully because integration invites exposure. You exist in the overlap. This position requires restraint, and restraint is harder than preparation. You don't use every advantage you have. You don't solve problems efficiently if efficiency draws attention. You let inconveniences persist if fixing them would raise questions. You choose delay over display, silence over explanation. People who bunker try to eliminate discomfort entirely. They aim for control, certainty, and insulation. People who endure accept discomfort as a trade. They tolerate cold rooms, slower routines, imperfect solutions, because those imperfections keep them invisible. Being boring also preserves flexibility. You aren't defending a fortress that others can challenge. You aren't tied to a single asset that must be protected at all costs. If attention shifts your way, you can disengage. You can relocate without abandoning everything. Your survival doesn't collapse if one location becomes compromised. This is why visible preparedness fails under pressure. It demands justification. It invites negotiation. It attracts those who feel entitled to what you have. The quieter you are, the fewer explanations you owe. The fewer explanations you owe, the fewer conflicts you face. When chaos peaks, the visible are tested first. Their plans are questioned. Their resources are examined. Their resolve is challenged. The boring are tested last, if at all, and by the time attention reaches them, most threats have already burned themselves out. In collapse, boredom isn't weakness, it's armor. It's easy to assume this was a Cold War solution for a simpler time. Fewer cameras, slower information, smaller populations. A world where disappearing was easier. That assumption misses the point. This strategy doesn't survive despite modern systems. It survives because of them. Modern infrastructure amplifies attention. Every transaction, movement, and deviation leaves a trace. Social media tracks behavior. Surveillance watches patterns. GPS logs motion. Digital payments record intent. Anything unusual stands out faster than ever. Bunkers don't protect you from this environment. They immobilize you inside it. Above-ground survival adapts because it doesn't try to escape the system all at once. It rides what still functions while quietly reducing dependency. You don't vanish overnight. You fade gradually. That matters because sudden absence attracts scrutiny. Gradual absence looks like normal variation. Fading is a behavioral skill. You reduce transactions without stopping them completely. You limit movement without freezing. You avoid peak hours without isolating. You blend with people who aren't panicking yet because panic is loud and traceable. You let infrastructure fail in front of you while you quietly decouple from its expectations. This strategy doesn't fight collapse. It outlasts it. Modern collapse isn't a clean break. It's uneven. One system fails while another limps along. One neighborhood tightens while another stays quiet. Hard exits create friction. Soft disengagement preserves options. Above-ground survival keeps you aligned with reality as it fragments instead of forcing you to choose a side too early. This is why the strategy scales so well. It doesn't require land, construction, or capital. There's no bunker to pour concrete into, no gear list to complete, no deadline to beat. It runs on awareness, restraint, and timing. Skills that can be adjusted daily instead of locked into place. That's also why it was never marketed. There's nothing to sell in fading, no dramatic build, no visible milestone, it doesn't photograph well, it doesn't promise safety, it only promises continued compatibility. And compatibility doesn't excite people until they lose it. Modern survival culture often falls into the same trap as Cold War bunker thinking. Over-preparation that creates rigidity. Plans become scripts, scripts become obligations. When reality deviates, the plan collapses with it. The modern world doesn't fail symmetrically. It fractures. Adaptation beats insulation. People who rely on bunkers wait for permission to emerge. Permission from authorities, from sensors, from timelines they no longer control. Above-ground survivors never fully go underground, so they never need permission to re-enter the world. They stay human. They observe. They adjust. They move when movement is safe and stay still when stillness is smarter. They remain compatible with systems long after those systems stop making sense. They survive not because they escaped the world. They survive because they stayed aligned with it longer than everyone else. So why isn't this taught anymore? Not because it stopped working, but because it doesn't fit a narrative of control. Modern systems are built on predictability, compliance, and visibility. They function best when people behave in standardized ways. This strategy does the opposite. Bunkers are easy to explain, easy to regulate, easy to monetize. They can be inspected, mapped, taxed, licensed, and sold. Fear turns into concrete. Anxiety turns into gear. Promises turn into products. The bunker narrative creates customers and compliance at the same time. This strategy sells nothing. It offers no structure to enforce and no checklist to complete. It relies on judgment instead of obedience. Timing instead of instruction, awareness instead of authority. And systems don't like anything that can't be measured, scheduled, or controlled. It also places responsibility where institutions prefer it not to be, on individuals making quiet decisions without permission. Decisions about when to move, when to stay, when to disengage, and when to blend back in. Those decisions can't be standardized. They can't be audited. They can't be overridden once made. Cold War planners understood something that never translated well into public doctrine. In prolonged collapse, survival becomes selective not by strength or preparation, but by behavioral adaptability. And adaptable people don't follow scripts. They improvise. They fade. They disengage when pressure rises and reappear when it falls. That made this doctrine politically inconvenient. It didn't support centralized narratives of safety. It didn't encourage mass compliance. It didn't reassure the public with clear steps and visible protections. Instead, it implied something far more uncomfortable, that long-term survival might require stepping outside collective behavior entirely. So it faded quietly. Public messaging shifted toward shelters, stockpiles, and heroic endurance. These ideas are easier to dramatize, easier to photograph, easier to turn into policy and product. They give the impression of control even when that control is fragile, but they also fail more easily. The world rarely ends in a moment. It erodes slowly, unevenly, and without clear boundaries. Systems decay before they collapse. Rules lose meaning before they vanish. Order thins long before it disappears. Erosion favors those who don't resist it head-on, but move with it selectively. Digging deeper doesn't make you safer in that environment. It makes you heavier. Less flexible, more visible once discovered. Survival belongs to those who can move when others are anchored to their plans. The Cold War trick never stopped working. It was simply replaced by louder stories that promised certainty instead of endurance. People forgot it existed because it asked too much of them. Patience, restraint, and the ability to live without guarantees. Now you know why it vanished, and why it still works.